Okay, we started our recording. I'm Tony Dubiel. If you haven't attended one of these before, this is a reoccurring online meetup that we have that typically we break it in two halves. The front end is usually a very specific topic related to network automation and Ansible. And on the second half, we've had an ongoing study group that has a study guide that we've been using and it's similar topics, but we're kind of focused on that as kind of like a longer term project as we go through, and it's meant for those folks who may be either preparing for the Red Hat specialist in Ansible network automation, or just want to learn more about network automation in Ansible. So it's fine to join even if you have no aspirations of going for the certification. And then again, the front end topics just range from just things that are newer with Ansible, or just cool topics, or just challenging things that folks are running into. And speaking of that, so today's topic is automating access list. And the reason why I wanted to show that particular topic is I've helped some customers with use cases where they're trying to one manage existing access list in a way that's a little bit easier for them in terms of like the lifecycle management of making additions and changes to those access lists, and then two for kind of dovetailing into more like compliance types of reasons. So being able to provide your typical compliance checks against if the access list is existing on a particular device and particular interfaces, and having a list of devices that are in or out of compliance. And then I guess the third piece of that would be what are the diffs? So just like any other configuration in these devices, there's always that chance for configuration drift. And as organizations are moving towards, defining what their single source of truth is, and being able to compare against that in terms of access lists. So I mentioned on the previous session, we went through the validated content, and the new collection for that, the network.base collection, has a way of looking and determining the configuration of the device, and then converting that configuration into YAML files. So it's kind of preparing your brownfield device for automation. And we went through and step through what that would look like on the previous session. Today's session is more like a double click into that, where instead of like looking at the entire configuration, we're really zooming into the access list and how we can benefit from resource modules to make it easier to pull in access lists, and to use that to compare against any changes that perhaps were made like out of band outside of the automation, to respond to like a security incident, or some quick fix for troubleshooting. And then for whatever reason it didn't make its way back into the single source of truth, so we can reconcile that fairly easily with the structured data that were provided in the resource groups, or in the resource modules rather. So that's kind of the main topic. I will mention some of the alternative ways of configuring or managing the access lists, or situations where you may need to utilize the other capabilities outside of resource modules. So we'll talk a little bit about Jinja 2 templates and the configuration modules using the lines parameter to do sort of like one-off things. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But again, the focus today is mainly around the resource module. So let me bring up the slides. It looks like things have quieted down. And if I hear the noise, I'll have to switch over. So just excuse me if you see me switching between tabs and things like that. So here's the today's session. And for some, it could be an arduous task of managing access lists. And probably before I get into this too deep, just curious, from your side of things, do any of you out there currently manage access lists on network devices? And what you can do too is, like, if you are unable to mute, you can use these little emojis. So you could send me a reaction, like a thumbs up if you do, just to give me an idea, how how much you guys are interfacing with that, specifically? Okay. And is there a thumbs down? Okay, so give me a thumbs down if you're having challenges managing them manually. Okay. And I kind of fall into that in terms of living through customers and just anecdotal stuff that I see that sometimes that's a challenge in larger environments where there's not just lots of access lists, but just the access lists or the entries, the ACEs within the access lists, become so large, and it's hard to manage them over time. So that's good to know. So in terms of access lists, just to make sure that everybody's on the same page. And let me let this person in real quick. Cool. Hey, John. So, hey, we just got started, so it's all good. All right, so I'm going back to slides. So here's the agenda for today. So we were just talking about access lists and folks who currently manually manage them and just some of the challenges in doing so. And today we're going to try to address some of that, or to alleviate some of that burden and heavy lifting through making it easier through automation. So before we do that, just in case some of you are newer to network access lists, it's just a quick level set. And I'm just going to kind of read through these. It's just a couple of slides, and this is more in line with best practices and things you would learn, like going through CCNA and stuff like that. Just things that you may not have thought about in a while, just to shake off some of the rust if it's been a while since you've configured an access list. So basically, an access list is a list of instructions you apply to the router's interface, and this, you know, tells the router effectively what packets, but also what ports to accept and deny. And normally, because we're talking about network access lists, they're not really true firewalls. So you're limited in what you can do. So it's mainly around source destination addresses and ports and protocols and established connections, things like that. But there's a lot of value in providing that in the network, as opposed to only blocking traffic on endpoints and through boundaries through firewalls, especially with zero trust security and segmentation. Being able to apply access lists really anywhere on demand has a lot of value. So the way that the access lists work is the placement of the ACL statement, or in the configuration, you'll see it named as an ACE. The router tests the packet against each condition statement in sequential order. So if you're looking, depending on what you're looking at, so for this demo today, as we go through, we're going to look at Cisco and Juniper, and you'll see we do have the sequential order based off of the entries. So each one of those would have a value associated with it, numerical, or in the case of Juniper, it's like the name from the term configuration. So you'll see it'll just look a little bit different when we look at the native configs, but they'll match up that way, and they work the exact same. All access lists work the exact same. So after the match is found, so that would create a condition to stop at that point. But if no match is found, then like the default would be to deny at the end, so all those packets would be discarded. So it's like an implicit deny any at the end, unless you flip it upside down and kind of do it more like a blacklist model, where you're going to effectively have a permit any. But normally the best practice is to do it the other way, right? So more in line with like zero trust. So it's like a whitelist type of model. And implementing access lists in practice, there's two ways, but the standard access lists, it's okay for like simple things if you're just wanting to prevent a particular source and destination network, but it doesn't include at the port level, so it's the entire protocol suite. Normally, we're using extended access lists, so you can apply those, based off of numbering. So it has a range. There's also extended ranges, and I don't remember like over time they added the extended ranges. I don't remember them completely off the top of my head, but there's additional numbering for that too. But because it's difficult to manage really either one of these, the standard access lists or the standard access list, by the numbering, you can use the naming. So that's what I do is I'll name the access lists regardless which type it is. And then we have the ability to use the entry sequence numbering like in Cisco, or the naming of the term like for Juniper. So we can point to a specific entry and change that configuration. And you'll see some of that as we go through, but we'll do it from an automated perspective. So one of the best practices is you have to be careful with access lists, because not only are they a challenge to manage manually, because you might have several different access lists across multiple devices, and then within each access list you may have a large number of entries. You have to be careful that you don't provide a situation where you deny traffic or block traffic that's unintended. So the best way to do this, to just make sure that in your changes you don't cause an outage, right, is you would first remove access groups from the interface. So but keep that in mind, that when you do that, if you're blocking specific traffic, that particular traffic would be allowed once you remove that access group from the interface. So normally that this should be done in a downtime anyway, but just keep that in mind. And then that allows you to modify or delete the access list, whatever you need to do, make that change, and you'll rebuild the access list to some extent depending on what you did to it, and then you're going to replace that access group on the interface, and then it'll start to apply whatever those changes were. You can different scenarios you can try outside of that, but you just need to be prepared and make sure that you account for any scenarios where you may lose traffic. And definitely if you're working with like the VTY groups, for your management access, you definitely don't want to block yourself out. Has anyone done that? I know I have. I've blocked myself out of routers before from remote access. So you just have to be careful with that as well. So that's what we have to take in consideration when we're working with these. So you can pretty much replicate everything that you do process wise through automation. So how do you do it? So what I recommend and highly suggest is that you should look at resource modules. And the reason why I'm kind of pointing everyone towards resource modules is it allows you to treat really any network vendor the same. Granted, if they have a resource module. So most of the main vendors do. There may be some that you're working with, that may not have went through that exercise yet. So for those, there are the workarounds that I talked about, and we'll mention that a little bit later. But if there are resource modules available, I would look into them. So this table here has the download. So the Automation Hub is the console at Red Hat. So if you're a customer of Ansible Automation Platform, then you would go here, and this is where the certified collections are. So that's where the resource modules will be part of a collection and certified, for each one of these vendors. So you can pull them down that way. If not, you can go to Galaxy, and that's where you can download them. Now, depending on how you're going to use Ansible would be different, like the install process. Like if you're running Ansible Core Engine locally for a command line, then you just install the collection locally, like on your laptop as an example. But best practice is to use a virtual environment. So just keep that in mind. And that's more around protecting the Python files and dependencies, in terms of that working as a Python application. So there's that. There's also the Ansible Navigator that we may see, you will see today. I'm going to use the Navigator as the newer tool that instead of installing locally, you use a container. And that container is called an execution environment. And in the lab, depending on how far we get in the labs today, we may get to the Navigator section, and you'll start to interact with these execution environments using the Ansible Navigator tool. So the benefit there is that those containers don't have to be installed, so you can have your dependencies, in a wrapper of a container. And those are the same containers that we use in the platform. And when I say platform, automation platform, for those of you who are not familiar with that, we're going to spend more time in that later. And also for the study group, it's a part of the certification test. So we'll spend some time, learning how to use it. But effectively, that is the evolution of Tower. So if you're familiar with Tower, you'll notice that the platform does what Tower did, but then there's additional components that do other things. Some of the examples are the private automation hub, so that you can have a local repository of all of your collections and your execution environments that you're using in the platform. And the second piece would be like newer capabilities, like the event-driven automation is a component of the automation platform. So those are things that Tower were not able to do. And now in the platform, the controller is what Tower used to be, and then we have these other components that are focused. It's more modular, and they're focused on a very scoped, capability that provides features and functions to the Ansible Automation platform. So I'm just going to open up one of these, since we're using Cisco and Juniper, just to show you here in the documentation and those links. And I'll provide this slide afterwards, so you'll have all these same links. So this is showing the resource module for Cisco. And when we look at Juniper, it's going to be very similar, but you'll notice there's a lot of parameters that we can configure here. But what's normally the first area that I look at is the examples. So if you scroll down, and there's a lot in here, huh? So you keep scrolling, scrolling, because there's a lot you can do with access lists. So did I pass? There should be. Did I go too far? Oh, here's the examples. Okay. Yeah, so here's examples that show you how to use it in different ways that you can use a resource module. So I'll table this for a second, because we're going to talk about it and go into the hands-on part, where we're going to see the different states. And the states are very interesting because it makes it very super easy to automate these types of platforms now by introducing different states and capabilities that really work the same across all these different protocols and functions of these devices, but also the same across different types of devices. So you'll start to see patterns where you're configuring a switch versus a router versus a firewall, and really a lot of the things that you're doing work the exact same way in Ansible. And also, regardless if you're using the platform or just the command line, a lot of the mechanics and underpinnings of it are similar as well. So we'll come back to some documentation if we need to. So the next thing is the resource modules. So we're going to talk about access lists, resource modules, and I'm going to give you the link to this repo. And in the README, it's explaining in context of what each one of those states that we're using in these playbooks are doing specifically for access lists. But for this slide, I just wanted to kind of give you a quick primer and level set on how these states work just in general, because we can use other resource modules, right, that are not access lists related. So if I go back up, let me just grab this, scroll up real quick. So towards the top of this thing, this is the iOS collection. So in the collection, there's several different modules. So if I click on Cisco iOS, there's tons of modules. The ones that I'm referring to that have these newer capabilities, they would all be prefixed here in the description with resource module. So these are all very specific to a certain type of configuration, and they would have similar states and capabilities. So when you learn how to manage access lists, you can apply a lot of what you learn to other protocols like BGP and OSPF, and all these different types of configurations that typically you would implement. In this case, on a router. So merged, and I don't know if I might have talked a little bit about this in the last session too, but merged is always the default. And because the way that Ansible provides state is that it has the notion of idempotent. And what that means is that it'll look to see if a config is already present on the device. And if it's not, then it'll add the configuration that you're either hard coding or iterating through like a variable file into a specific parameter in your playbook. It'll make that change. But if it doesn't need to make that change, it'll leave that configuration alone. So for whatever module that was in that task, it'll just move sequentially, into the next task and work on that one. So sometimes you may have a configuration, and this is one of the cases that happens a lot with access lists, where you have like an existing configuration, but you want to change it, and it's like a nested configuration in the access list. So one of those entries, or what they call ACEs, right? Maybe you want to change a port or a protocol or something like that. We can replace those existing configurations using replaced. Now, if we want to completely remove like a section um, of a configuration or override, so to just overwrite what's already there, then we can use overridden. And if we want to remove the entire access list, we can use delete it. And we'll go through these. You'll see them in practice. And then gathered is read only. And what it does is it'll pull in the configuration for just access lists or a specific access list. So all the entries. And this is very powerful because it pulls it in as structured data. So the default is JSON. You can change it to YAML, which is something that I do to create like a configuration file. So you can work with structured data and it becomes very malleable. You can manipulate it. So this is very powerful because you can take a configuration, and not just an access list configuration, with any of these resource modules, you can pull in the configuration really for the entire device, right? So just gather it for each of the resource modules that kind of equal the totality of the configuration of that device. And that whole configuration is JSON. That validated collection for network.base had a role that does that for you. So you don't even have to think about it. It's already there. It'll grab the whole config and it turns it all into data. And once you have that data, now you have variables defined that you can use for your configuration to change, for other devices, or to like just take something that's not automated and now you can, go through that transition to automating the management of that device. And that's what we'll do here with Access List. Rendered and parsed are also read-only, but they're for a different purpose. So rendered is read-only, and what it does is it'll take the configuration that you're sending or that you would send to that device, and it converts it to the native command line. So like iOS commands. Juniper's a little bit different because the default configuration syntax, right, is the netconf. So it converts it into the netconf config that would be on the device. But with the Juniper, you can actually look at the config in different ways. You can look at it as set commands. Oh, let me grab that real quick. Just make sure everyone gets in. Sorry about that. You can use the set commands. You can use the netconf, or you can use JSON, structured data as the config. But the default one that'll come back from rendered is the netconf. And you'll see that. We'll run through one of those. And then parsed is a little bit different than gathered. Where gathered, you pull it, you actually connect to the device, and then it's just like gathering facts. So you'll gather the facts for that resource module, and you'll pull them down. With parsed, it's meant to work against a running configuration file, or whatever that device calls their running configuration, right? And the way that you achieve this is typically you'll run like a config backup, right? So it's offline. And then you can take that offline config in its native command line format, like if just using like the config module off of like iOS. So iOS underscore config, and you do the backup command, and it saves that running config to either your local server where you're running Ansible, or you save it somewhere else to to a different server or to a Git repository or wherever the case may be. You can take that, it'll compare against that and convert it into the actual command lines that would be sent, the native command lines. So if you recall, like the basics of a playbook, you're interfacing on the front end with a playbook using a YAML file, right? And that's where you're defining parameters. On the back end at runtime, in networking, it's normally Python scripts, right? And the Python scripts are converting, from that data that's coming in that format, it's input that it converts into the actual raw, native command lines that it's sending to the device. So that's the serialized data that's being pushed to that device. So that's what it's showing you is what the actual module would send. So you may need to see that because you're trying to figure out when I configure it, CLI way, what does it look like in structured data and vice versa. Then you can play around with these modules offline and you don't have to connect to the devices using parsed. So what happens or why, what are these scenarios when we don't want to use a resource module? Or maybe we can't use a resource module. And I actually ran into a very specific example or a great example of this while putting this together. So from an alternatives, you can use like the iOS underscore config module has a lines parameter, and so does Juniper, and so does Arista, and all the ones that are building as part of the ecosystem. That's a requirement for them is to provide those exact modules, right? So if you use that module, then the notion of lines, and it also has an alias name commands, it's sending, like, you're listing out the exact commands that you want to send to that device. And depending on where the command lives, like what level, like for example, maybe it's at config T level, or like in Juniper, like you would just use set commands like at the highest level. But whenever you want to go into like a nested command, like interfaces or routing protocols, right? Then that's the notion of like a parent config in lines. So like for big T is a default, then it goes into like interfaces, and then you're configuring like an IP address and mask. Then you would use parents, and then go into the interface if you're using this particular module. And it allows you to kind of emulate how you would manually configure the device, but still use the constructs of Ansible to automate it, right? So the benefit there is like you don't have to know a lot of Ansible to get that to work, but you have to know a lot of command line because you have to have the right order and know exactly what you want to configure. And it's a bit slower because each one of those lines, it's okay when it's a one-off and it's a couple of things, very scope that you're configuring. But if you're configuring like a lot of config in a playbook, or there's a lot of devices that you need to connect to, then you have to iterate through all those lines, and it adds like a the the turnaround time of the actual automation itself. It's going to mess around with the velocity of how fast you can make those changes. So it's usually more of a fix than like a preferred method. The Jinja 2 templates are also a part of the config modules, and you use the source parameter. And that's where you, in the source, you'll point to where the config file, where the Jinja 2 file, the .j2 file lives. And that file is a template. And it could be like the exact command lines, or you can variabilize it, have variable placeholders. But the challenge there is that it has to have the exact syntax or it won't work. So that's a lot quicker. You can push config changes through Jinja 2 templates a lot faster. So it works with access lists. If it has tons of entries, it'll be a lot quicker than trying to iterate through them as lines. But it has to be the exact syntax. So anything that's like nested and all that kind of stuff, it's kind of hard to build those templates. And it's easier to like make an initial configuration, but it's harder to make changes using those templates. So the reason why I would fall back to these is you may notice with resource modules, not every vendor is at the same has the same coverage in terms of what you can do in the resource module. Some of them have gaps. So I ran into a gap with Juniper, a small gap that I can work around easy with lines, because all I'm doing is using it to apply the access list to a tunnel interface. So what I ran into is it works fine with physical interfaces, but when you try to use the tunnel interface, there was a problem there. So I'm gonna open up or what we call logging an issue on their GitHub, and let them know, and then I'll show them, my results and all that kind of stuff. So those types of things are usually easily fixed. It could just be like an oversight thing where someone just didn't think to check like the tunnel interface or something like that, or like for whatever reason I'm doing something wrong, but I don't think so, but I'm going to work through that. But for now, I'm using lines to work around that. Another one I ran into is advanced features. So like policers and like sampling, like when you want to sample the actual data and call that from an access list. Those advanced features typically don't exist in resource modules because they may not be available across most vendors anyway. It's like more specific to how you would implement it on that device. So it's hard to kind of turn them in to resource modules, or it's just like it's further down in that timeline. So if there's like a roadmap of what they want to include in resource modules, then some of the advanced stuff is still out there. But the good news is there's nothing that you can't automate, right? Because anything you can command line configure in these boxes, you can automate through Ansible. It's just you may not be able to use the resource modules. They're kind of like the lowest common denominator of like all the main things, and then you'll see things added over time. And some vendors have been on board with resource modules longer than others. So coverage is just different, But for the most part, you'll find that 80% of it's all good, and then you'll see like little things like that is just a part of the journey with just these companies. The good news is more and more of them are wanting to participate, so it's just going to take some time for them all to get up to the same level. So having said that, I want to get into the actual demo. So in the demo here, what we have is we have a router that's Cisco, and we have a router that's Juniper, and a GRE tunnel in between. The reason why I have a GRE tunnel, and this is kind of like how I ran into that little hiccup with GRE tunnels in the resource module, is because I'm running these two routers in AWS. And when you run routers in AWS, a lot of the layer 2 stuff and multicast, like your routing protocols, they're not going to work unless you use a tunnel. So with the GRE tunnel, I can have OSPF between these routers. And what I wanted to do was apply access lists to the tunnels inbound. So everything needs to work or traffic can't get across between these two routers. So we can actually test to make sure that our ports and everything are working as we make changes. So it's the same ports on each side. It's just that on the Juniper, I think 443 doesn't really connect anything. But I think all the ports do work on this. So I was just opening up what I could connect to on the router itself. I think 80 does work over here, but we'll test that out. And let me see if there's anything else. Yeah, so these are just some links so I can jump into the actual demo. Does anybody have any questions before I bring up the different screens and stuff? Does anyone have any questions on resource modules or just access lists before we start getting into the moving parts? And feel free to unmute yourself, or you can just jump in the chat room. I can't promise that I always notice the chat all the time, but I think I hear it when someone adds something in there. Okay, so it sounds like we're okay to go ahead and get into the demo here. So I'm going to go ahead and in terms of screens, what I want to show you is over here. This is the Cisco router. This is just a console in AWS. Right, so in this router, router 1, ACL, I'm going to go ahead and show you and make sure the access list is in there to begin with. All right, so at the moment, these are what we're allowing. So 80, 443, 22 for SSH. 830 is for netconf. So it's just another port that I could turn on. And you have to use netconf to manage the Juniper. And then I had some ephemeral ports and OSPF and ICMP. So this just popped up because that's OSPF right here. So we'll be able to see the console going off as things connect. And then in the running config, if you actually want to see that part too, show run. Right, so you can see here. So actually this one lost the actual ports because it should say greater than. So let me grab that one real quick before we start. So if I go into my repository here, I should still have, router 1. I just want to make sure I have a good baseline that we're starting from. This might not even be what I want. Oh yeah, here we go. Yeah, it should have had this entry here. So let me go ahead and add that one before we get started. All right, so I think someone just popped in. Let me grab them real quick. Oh, wrong one. No. Over here. Sorry, I got kind of lost in where I'm at. Let me get this out of the way. Right here. Dang, where'd they go? I don't know what happens if I don't accept it fast enough. I'm not sure what happens to them. Well, maybe they'll try to get back in if it didn't allow them to come in the first place. All right, so back to here, and well, actually back to here. Yeah, so let me pop this in there real quick to make sure we're starting from where I want to be. And I guess I have to do that. We'll make sure that the access list is working before we get started. Yeah, that's what I wanted. Let me save that one. All right, so that's that side. The other side of it is the Juniper. So with that one, I'm just going to run this command so we can just get to the firewall section and its config. It's a little bit easier to read as set commands. So here's what the firewall has currently there. So it's similar. It's just that instead of pointing to indexes as numbers, then we have names that we use here. So like you have the web one and HTTPS, and there's more same stuff, SSH, and then the ephemeral ports at the end. So hopefully everything is okay. So I should be able to just check real quick. So if I telnet, I already put the command in the router to make my source IP address defined over here, so I don't need to worry about that. But in router, this is router 1. The Juniper router is router 3. So it has a loopback of 192.168.3.3, and then router 1 has 192.168.1.1. So that's what we're trying to connect to. And like one of the ports should be 22. So right away, what's wrong here? Let me see if anything is set. I got to wait for it to time out. Let me try from this side too, and then we'll fix it real quick. So I go back to here. This one, I do have to put the source address. All right, so 80 works. And the remote host not responding. Let me see if I can get to this one locally too. So if I just change this. Yeah, so locally it's turned on, so something else is going on. So let me just check the other ones. 22, or I think it was 22. It was trying to get to 22 is what I couldn't connect to. So it's definitely works. And then I don't know about 443 being turned on. Okay, it does work. All right. All right, so let me check and make sure that that's just it. This is just it talking to itself. So what I want to do is, leave this alone, the source, and change this to 1.1. All right, so I was able to get to 22 on that side and see how it shows it on the console here. And then let's see if I can get to 80. Yeah. And there was that 830 was on there. Okay, so the Juniper to the Cisco looks good. Now let's see what's up the other way. It looked like my OSPF was on. Let's see, OSPF neighbor. Yeah, so that's there with the full adjacency. Let's try to telnet to a port. Let me try something, the different ones. All right, so that worked. 80. Maybe it's just a glitch. Let's see. Or maybe it was missing 22. I just didn't notice that when I was over there. So hop back over here. I already have it. Yeah, this so we can see the firewall. Maybe let me make this bigger. Yeah, I don't see the 22's not in there. All right, so let me grab that real quick. I don't know why that wasn't in there. I was messing around with it earlier, so maybe. Oh no, here it is. Source address, destination address.
Only on the Cisco router, when you applied the new one, did that overwrite something from before? Could that be causing the drop?
Yeah, I think like for going this direction, right? If 22 is open, and then it should be okay. I think I had on the other side it was applied and all that good stuff. So let's see here. Maybe the order I changed. I could wipe this out and put it back in. I just want to have a good starting point real quick. So when I go back to here, let me see what order it originally was. Or it's down here. Yeah, it was further down. To remove it, or manually remove it, I can delete. I have to take it off the interface, and then I'll move it that way. But let me look at the one more time, just in case I'm blind here on the Cisco side of things. So I'll go back to here and this. With access list, outbound is good unless you deny, right? So it's really just coming back. So I have these, I'm accepting these ports back.
So you had a TCP any before greater? Oh, okay. You have greater than 32.
Yeah, so maybe well, when you connect to 22, maybe it's not ephemeral that comes back.
Yeah,
it's 22. So I probably should just add, or I'll just
you
skip
had a
that.
TCP any before, and that got overwritten with the last number 70.
Yeah, that's why it would have worked before, but I wanted to do the ephemeral ports.
Yeah.
To show that. So I'll leave 22 alone for now. And it works coming from the Juniper to here, but it's just not going to work because I'm not allowing it back.
Okay.
So I think that's what's going on. But 80 and all, I have enough stuff to test against. So that's how I want to start. So I wanted to have like an access list that's already there. So these are brownfield access lists that are running. And so now we want to start interacting with them. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to show you some playbooks before I run them. So this one is to see if I even have the access list. So the name of that access list is Meetup. So I don't know why I have to keep. Maybe I'll do this. Yeah. So it's named Meetup right here, and it's the same name for on Juniper as well. So what I want to do is I created a variable for that. And in Ansible, there's various locations that you can add the variable. So what I did is I just added it to the inventory. So I have a group of Juniper and a group of Cisco, and I have a variable that I want to apply to all my groups. So I just created that variable under the all group, and the all group's just implicitly already there. So it's going to say that the access name for both of these groups is Meetup. If I want to do something different on these, then I can move it to like group vars or host vars to be more specific to a host. So you can move your variables, and there's an order that Ansible will search. It'll search in your inventory, and then it'll look for like folders like this, like group vars. So in this group var, I have Cisco, and it has like the connection type for Cisco and the SSH key that I'm using, like the path to it to connect, and the OS type. So this is just only going to work with Cisco routers. In Juniper, everything is the same, but the connection type's different, right? So I have netconf, so same user because it's in AWS, but the connection type's different. So I have to use netconf, and then the OS is different because it's Juniper. So these are specific to those groups. I could have defined that in the inventory, but the next location is a group vars. And then what we're going to do here in a moment is we're going to create host vars with our access list configuration that will push onto the devices. So, but before we do that, do we even have the access list? So what I wanted to do is like a compliance check. So the way that works, and you can see here that I'm using the Cisco iOS ACLs resource module. I want to use the state of gathered, so it'll pull in the access list information from the Cisco router that's in my Cisco group. So that's the Cisco _ ACL. I think that's how it was named. Yeah, this one right here, Cisco _ ACL. So it's going to use that as the target. So when I go back into here, right, so I created a condition. That's what when is. So only for Cisco, because Cisco has its own module, I only want to run it against Cisco devices. So for the Juniper, I'm doing the exact same thing, but I have a condition that says only if you're in the group Juniper. So it's still going to gather it. It's using the Juniper networks collection, right? So it's all pretty much the same, but I'm using a condition so that when I call it up here in my host, Cisco is going to go in the ones that are looking for Cisco, and Juniper is only going to be rendered, from the ones that have a condition for Juniper. So the next thing that I want to do here is I pull down structured data, and what I'm looking for is the actual access list. So before I do that, what I wanted to do is, instead of working with like the structured data path, which gets kind of long and confusing, I wanted to set a fact. So that way I can take whatever I'm pointing to in data here, and I can turn it into a variable. So set fact, you can create a variable pretty much from anything, any information that you're pulling in. So when I gather that data from access lists, I register it in memory with this register parameter. And then in memory, I'm parsing to just the ACLs. And the name of the ACL that I want is this ACL _ name, which is defined, back here, meetup. So some other tricks that I have is to make this easier, because parsing through JSON is kind of difficult, especially when you have nested values like this one is, to some extent, where you have like a dictionary, key value pairs that might be a part of a list, and a list that has a dictionary, and so on and so forth. So I can use what we call a JSON query, and that's what this is over here, to look at the JSON that I pulled in and registered, and to take that JSON and to enable JSON query. And it's sort of like a Google search for JSON. And I'm able to use different flags. In this particular one, contains is all I'm looking for is meetup to be in the ACLs data. So even though I have like a list of a bunch of, well, not a bunch, there's like 3 different ACLs that are already on that Cisco box, then it's only going to parse to the one that's named meetup. And the same thing for Juniper, right? So it all works the same. It's just parsing through that JSON data. The third thing I do is, once I can identify and make that check. So JSON queries are just one way that you can check. There's also like validate module. That one's a little bit more complicated. I kind of use this one for most things, unless it's something like specific for like a test case. But this one's pretty straightforward. But you do have to have the James path Python module installed where you're running Ansible for it to work. So this one, it'll find that, and once it finds it, I can use what we call an assertion. So in the assertion, what I'm saying is that you have to have meetup, in this variable that we created, set facts, for the name. And if it's not there, it fails, and if it's there, it succeeds. So this is basically how you do a quick compliance check, where you're just looking for something very specific, and you have structured data. When you're working with unstructured data, you can use regular expressions to point to something and still do assertions. You're just looking for strings, in the text output or whatever, standard output. You can do that too, but this is like specific to actual data, and it works the same way. So it's either there or it's not. So it either passes or it fails. So the first thing is, do we have that access list? And what I'm going to run is Ansible Navigator, which may be new to some of you, instead of Ansible Playbook. And the command is run. Let me get this out of the way. And the name of the playbook, right? So this one is the first one, so I can just tab through that. And then there's different modes. You can run it in the TUI mode, where it runs like within like this menu, this new menu that I'll show you this in the study group part if we get to that part, or standard output. So it looks just like a normal playbook. So before I hit enter, let me make it bigger so it's a little bit easier to see. So it's pulling down the container. That's what this stuff is. with the collections in it. And then now it's running it. Right, so you can see that Meetup is present in Cisco ACL and Juniper ACL. And if I had multiple routers, it would just list them out, and we would see if it's either present or fails. So that's why we have the present message. So we know the access list is there. The next thing I mentioned was like managing automation, right? So if we hadn't automated, we know we have access lists with entries on both of those boxes. So if I want to pull them in, I can use this playbook. And this playbook's kind of interesting. This is something that translates over to stuff outside of access lists as well. So the first thing I'm doing, again, is gathering the facts of just the resource module for ACLs, right, for both vendors. And then what I'm doing is I'm creating a directory that doesn't exist yet for host vars. I have group vars, but I'm creating host vars. And the inventory name will be the name of each router that's in the inventory back here. So it'll create a file for each one of those that will include the gathered information. But I do not want it in JSON. So that was the next thing I need to do is I'm going to take and register what I gathered into both of these Cisco _ACLs and Juniper _ACLs. And then what I'm doing here is I'm taking each one of those and converting it to YAML. So instead of JSON, it converts to YAML. And this is what we call a filter plugin. And there's different filter plugins that do different things, but this one just converts, to YAML. And then there's also a nice JSON, because sometimes you'll have like a blob of JSON output, and then it'll organize it in a structure that's more human readable. So they call it nice in that regard. So we get our nice JSON that's readable, and it's useful because we can use this to create our, define our variables. And then the destination will go into that directory that we created, and this will append ACLs, to the end of the host name.yaml file, and we'll be able to use that moving forward. So we do it for both of these, the Cisco and the Juniper. So now if I can just bring this back up so we can see it. So I'm going to run this one. So we know we have the access list, so let's go ahead and ingest it and convert it. Now, sometimes you have to refresh this thing to see it. So here's my host vars. So I go into host vars, I've got Cisco and I've got Juniper, and I click here, and I have a nice YAML file that has taken the existing configuration as it is currently, the current state of that configuration in both of those routers, and created this file. And it has all the proper indentation and everything for YAML. And if I go to Juniper, I've got this one. And you'll notice that, like I mentioned earlier, when I'm in Cisco, I've got sequence numbers. And then when I'm in Juniper, there's a name. You see the name here, netconf. So it just names them. It uses a named ACE entry as opposed to Cisco, where we've got the sequence numbers. So those are there, and we've prepared them to use for automation. So the next thing that I wanted to do is a check. So I'll run this check later because we haven't changed anything, right? We have the exact same configuration that we started with. But just to give you an idea what it does, and then we'll run this later after we change. We'll make a change and run this so that you can see it. What I want to do is just make sure that we're have the same on both sides. So a quick check, which there's no way that we wouldn't, but just to show you. All right, so in this one, and I should go through the playbook real quick. No, I haven't. I thought I had it up here already. Yeah, number 3, this one right here. So in this one, what I'm doing is a diff. So I'm going to run it against Cisco and Juniper. I'm going to gather the information or the data, structured data again. I pull it in, and this time what I'm doing is I want to take that structured data, register it. I call it Cisco gathered and Juniper gathered, and I want to turn it into YAML because, as you recall, every time we gather it, the default's JSON. So we'll turn it into YAML, and we're going to save it into our host vars directory and create a new YAML file called diff.yaml. And then what we're going to do is we're going to compare. And the way that you can do that is you don't actually copy the file. Like the source here is the diff file, and the destination is the one that was already in there, the ACLs file that it created, under Cisco and Juniper. And what it does is a check mode. So a check mode means it's not actually going to copy the contents, over top what's already in there. It's going to show you what would happen. And I'll turn on diff so that we can see exactly what the difference is. So here's, your diff file, and here's your ACL file. Is there anything different? So now there should only be like small nuance of just what the name of the dictionary is type of thing. But as we make changes, we'll see that. We'll see if like an entry is different running on the box versus what we think is our single source of truth back in our host vars. So with this one, just to see the mechanics of it, just go ahead and run it real quick. So right here, the only thing that's really different was the name, but all the contents. And what it shows here is just truncated. But there's actually an artifact that I have in another directory, so we don't have to look at it. But it would have like the entire contents. But anything that is different, it would highlight in red. So right now, it's just the actual name of the dictionary. So right now we have a good diff, if you will. None of the actual entries underneath the access lists were called out. So we'll come back to that one. So the next thing here is the merge. So I guess what I can do is let me go into Juniper. So it's vars. Well, not that one. This vars. Right. So what I wanted to do was let me see if it's already in here. I think it's not. The 830's in there. What was I going to add? I think I put a file in here so I'd remember. Oh, port 8080. So I'll grab this one real quick. 8080. Go back into here. I might have to play with this just a second to get the indentation right when I paste it. It seems like it went in. Okay. So this is a new entry, right? So I'll save it. File, save. And now that I think about it, that is different than what's on the device, right? Because we haven't sent that yet. So let me do this drift one more time. So if someone went in out of band and changed something, or if the config here has something that's missing on the other side, we should be able to see that. Yeah, see how that shows now? It just shows the entry that's different in red. So if we ran across this on a check, if someone had added it to the router, like, because it sees it from the diff from both sides, then we would be like, oh, yeah, someone had changed this access list, but it's different than what we have in a config. So then investigate further. Was that done on purpose? Should all the devices have that port open or blocked? And have a way of detecting, at the entry level, or what they call the ACEs in the structured data. We can see that. So let's say like that's there now, and we want to add it. So if we're adding something new, we can use merge. So I've saved it into the Juniper config file, so we can just send that off, and it should work. See how Juniper changed, but Cisco didn't? Green for OKs and kind of yellowish orange for changed. And then this is just the interfaces. I disable and enable the interface. It's just like I mentioned earlier, like follow the best practice that we use from manual. That's in the playbook as well. So let me show you the merged playbook. Here we go, merged. So in this one, it removes it. This is a resource module, but I had one in Juniper. I was having an issue trying to use this format here, or the .0. Either way should point to the tunnel interface. It worked with the physical interface, but not this. So I went ahead and reverted back to using lines. So see how I just use this is just like the set commands, but to remove it, it's a delete command. So I'm using that. And then after both of these are removed, then we go ahead and we can merge our config. We didn't change the config here, so it's the idempotency of it said don't do anything. But this one we did change, so it did change to Juniper, and then we just apply the interfaces again. And then this one I commit that change at the end because it wasn't implicitly in there like the resource module is. So both of those have been changed. Now merge works with something that you're adding that's not there, but what you'll notice, it has a problem when you're trying to use it the way that you're supposed to use replace. So if I go back into I'll go into Cisco and see how this is www is just port 80. I could just change that to something else. And maybe like I need to change the port for whatever reason. The web server port's different sometimes because that's configurable. So we change it here, I save it. And if I attempt to use merge, that's not how merge was set up for these resource modules. So if I run it again, it should not like that. Yeah, see here, it's saying I have to use replaced or overridden. So that's something that we could create a variable for. Like I'm doing separate playbooks just to show you, but like you could change the state so that it's something that you could change from a config file. Like the state is this time it's merged. Now this next time I run it, it's replaced. But we're just going to run replaced. Is number 5. And this should allow me to modify existing. So the only thing different in this playbook is the state is replaced. So just to show you that, if it's in here. Yeah, here's 5. Replaced. But we did change the port 80. So it worked here. Right. So we shouldn't be able to get to that port because we were able to do that from here earlier. From this side. Well, actually 80 worked on both sides. It was 22 that was messed up coming from the Cisco to this side. Right. See, now it won't work because we removed 80. But 8080 doesn't work either because it doesn't really have, I don't have a way of turning that on. Or I guess I could configure the router to use 8080 for its management. But see, there's nothing to connect to. But we probably saw it coming on this side. Oh, I have to make this small. Get rid of you. Or we only see the ones that go outbound back to it. All right, so right now we have that port 8080 in there. We replaced it. So the next one is, what if I want to remove something altogether? So that type of change is the overridden. So if I go back to what we added in Juniper over here, that was this 8080, I can take this whole entry out. Save this. And it should remove it with the overridden. That was on the Juniper. So it should take 8080 out of Juniper, and we should be able to see it gone. You'll see it change, just Juniper, but Cisco is still the same. Yeah, see how it just starts? The first one's web, so there is no 8080 above it anymore. So that's as expected. Let me get out of quit, right? All right, so one of the other things is to delete the access list if we just, for whatever reason, we want to remove them altogether. So we'll do that, and then every port should work. So that's 7. And the difference here too is the state. We'll say delete, but then after it, like because I'm removing it, there's no reason to bring the interface, to apply it back to the interface. So that one does look a little bit different. Let me just click on it over here. So you'll notice this one, I've got stated deleted, but then I don't apply it again because that wouldn't make sense. It's not there anymore. So if I go back to this one, it shouldn't be in there. How do you clear this? Just get it so I know where I'm starting from. Yeah. So here, this command's still there, but the actual access list command, it removes that entire access list. So it doesn't remove this one command. So if I wanted to clear this out of here, that would have been like another thing where I'd have to use like the lines to do that. But all the entries, and it's not applied to the interface anymore. All that stuff's gone off of it right now. And I should be able, it ran it on both of these, so I should be able to still connect to stuff. Yeah, so that's port 80. Was this the side that couldn't do 22, or was it the other one? Oh, port. And then right now this one, or this one, the Cisco side. Cisco is here. Ah. .192, .168, .3.3. 22 should work right now because there's no, if the port should be able to come back. Yeah. And 80 should work. Yeah. Yeah, so there's nothing going on that prevents anything, and I'll just verify real quick. Yeah, there's no access list, so it's a kind of a clean slate. So if I didn't mean to do that, if that was like a mistake, then I could just use merge again, right? Because there's nothing in there. I can just merge my config back in real quick. And it'll apply the access list. So one last thing here that's kind of interesting was rendered. So I'll let this run real quick. And then I'll show you rendered. So changed. Okay, so we'll just look at this side. Right, so the access list is back. So rendered is the one that's kind of interesting because it shows me like my command lines. So I may be interested in like that translation. So to use that, just render, right? I don't have to do anything to the interfaces because this is read only. So I can just run the module, right? It'll show me on the screen. But to see at the level that I want to see without having to do like a debug to show it on the screen, I'll do this one with verbosity just so we see all the data. So that one is 8. Oh, I forgot to do. Well, let's see what happens. I might be able to see. No, just see it's too summarized there. So do it with a -V. What happened here? Oh, I did capital. All right, so here's Cisco commands, and we can make this more viewable for us, but you can see it's just the normal commands that how you would see them in like a running Cisco configuration. And then the default for Juniper is that netconf. So that's why it has those NCs there. But it's its native configuration as opposed to the structured data. So we may want to do that just to compare or to wrap our head around like configuring it the old way versus what it looks like as structured data. And you can use rendered for that purpose. So that's what I have today for this demo. And I need to switch over so we can spend a little bit of time on the study group. Or those that are only interested in this, feel free to, you can drop off and then we'll start the study group and do that for a little while. But let me get back to where I can see you folks. Does anybody have any questions before I cut off the recording access list wise?
Yeah, I have a quick question, Tony.
Okay.
I think you showed another one with rendered. You had something parse or something in your slide.
Yes. Parsed, I need to back up the running config file because
Okay.
that's like an offline check.
Okay.
So that one I didn't set up like a backup. I could have did that, like use the config module where you can do a backup, and then once you have the backup, you can use that to turn it into structured data.
Got it. Okay, thank you. And
Yeah.
what's the difference between using Navigator versus just Ansible Playbook?
Yeah, so Ansible Playbook, you install Ansible on whatever the device is directly, normally in a virtual environment, like a Python virtual environment for the best practice. The Navigator uses a container. So the collections, instead of me installing them locally, they're already packaged in those execution environment containers.
But in terms of the Playbook file, there's nothing changes, basically, same Playbook.
Yeah, everything's the same. The only difference is like in the beginning, it pulls down this container. That's where all the Ansible stuff is running from.
Okay.
And in the study group, we're going to go through, I don't know how much we'll get through that today, but definitely the next section will make it to that point where we'll go in and like really examine how to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and shut this one off in terms of the recording.